So chapter 24 is about DNA viruses. And you need to know the names of the DNA viruses listed here, and their alternate names or common names, and the diseases and the names of the diseases they cause. Sometimes the name of the disease is different than the name of the virus. So we're going to look at smallpox, which is variola, 5 of the human herpes viruses. There are more than 5, but we're going to look at the first 5. And Hepatitis, which causes hepatitis. So variola is smallpox. And one thing I want to point out is that smallpox is not the same thing as chickenpox. Sometimes students get confused because they both have the word pox. And you can see here, infection comes through inhalation of the virus particles, and you have these skin lesions. The skin lesions are always there. There's never asymptomatic cases. At one time, smallpox had a 20% mortality rate, which is death. Now, smallpox is the first human disease that we believe is eradicated, means no longer in the world. And the reason it was able to be eradicated is a combination of factors. They developed a vaccine. It was well distributed, very stable, inexpensive, and very effective. Smallpox doesn't have any animal reservoirs. So once you treat all the people who have it, then you've covered all your bases. You don't have to worry about a hidden animal reservoir. And the symptoms are very obvious. You get quick diagnosis and quarantine. There's no asymptomatic cases, and the virus is only spread by close contact, so as long as they quarantine people, they can stop it. So they were able to eradicate it. Now, stocks of the virus are still kept in Russia and the U.S., and maybe elsewhere that we don't know about, but it's not found in terms of human hosts. Now, herpes. The family that the herpes viruses belong to is called Herpes viridae. So that's the family name of this group. It's really the most prevalent of the DNA viruses. Unlike smallpox, herpes is very often latent. And that means it can be inactive inside of cells and then at some point be reactivated to cause disease to reappear. Herpes used to be called herpes simplex, and now it's called human herpes. And so if you see HSV, that's the older terminology for herpes simplex virus. Now it's called HHV, human herpes virus. And then they're given a number in the order in which they were discovered. Herpes 1 and 2 are going to be the first 2 that we discuss. And this is where herpes 1 and 2 will typically be found. You can have ocular herpes, so an infection in the eye. Fever blisters would be an infection in the mouth. You can have herpes on your hand, which is called whitlow, and you can have genital herpes. Now, after you get the infection in one of these places, shown by the red dot, then the herpes virus goes to your ganglia, and the ganglia are right along your spinal cord, and that's where the virus becomes latent. So it's in your neural tissues, and then it can reemerge later. So like I said, herpes 1 and 2, these are typically start off as skin lesions, which you get from direct contact with somebody else. After the primary infection, viruses stay in your ganglia, And there's no way to cure or eliminate a latent virus right now. Maybe in the future. So, just very quickly, the ones I just mentioned, oral herpes gives you fever blisters. That's usually caused by HHV1, gingivostomatitis, and herpetic pharyngitis. You can tell this gingivo, you might recognize that as referring to your gums, and pharyngitis is your pharynx, your throat. So, around your mouth, in your mouth, down your throat. All of those are herpes. So you get these inflammations and blisters. Now, genital herpes, that's usually caused by HHV2, but it can be transmitted to the oral region, so some oral infection could be HHV2. Because if there's oral sex with someone who has an HHV2 genital infection, then it can transfer. The lesions are very painful. So this is the oral fever blisters in this picture. Over here on the right, this is a genital blister. On the finger, it's called Whitlow. And on the eye, it's called ocular. So those are pretty common for HHV1 and 2. And so usually if you get it in the eye, you only get it in one eye. So that's typical. Neonatal herpes is actually very dangerous. So if you have a mother who has herpes 1 or 2 and she delivers vaginally, the baby can be infected and it's very dangerous for the baby. Usually you have to have contact with active lesions to catch herpes. However, they've noticed that some people who are asymptomatic can still pass on the virus to someone else. So that makes it tricky. HHV1 is typically passed from around in children. So a lot of people have some latent HHV1. HHV2 is mostly from sexual activity in teenagers and early 20-year-olds around that age. Now, the third herpes virus is HHV3, is also called varicella zoster. And that's the disease, actually. Varicella is the disease name, and it's also called chickenpox. When children get it, it's not typically very severe, but in adults it can be very severe. And then zoster is also called shingles, and that occurs in adults. And really, the zoster is the reemergence of the chickenpox, of the varicella, in a particular way. So nowadays you can get a shot for or a vaccination for varicella and a vaccination for zoster. Fundamentally the same thing. A latent virus, so if you've had actual chickenpox, you actually had the chickenpox disease, then the HHV3 goes latent into your ganglia, and usually it goes into a particular ganglion in your back here. You can see on picture number 1. And then later on in life, it will reemerge, and it creates this band of, it's called a dermatome. It's a very hot, inflamed band of skin, and it's very painful. That's called shingles. But it's a reemergence of the latent chickenpox. You can have this band, that's very common. I've heard of other patterns of reemergence, but you get this very thick band of a rash. Instead of just little dots all over your body, you have a more concentrated rash for shingles. HHV4 is EpsteinBarr. And if you look at this, 90% of humans have an asymptomatic infection of Epstein-Barr. So mono is caused by Epstein-Barr, so what we call mono. However, a lot of people have Epstein-Barr and never get mono, so there's a lot of asymptomatic cases. We don't know why some people get the mononucleosis disease, but some people do. And just like a lot of things, things that are not very serious for you, if you're a healthy adult, can be very serious for immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, or very young children, or fetuses, pregnant women's fetuses. Human herpes virus 5 is called Cytomegalovirus. The infected cells become very enlarged, and under a microscope they have a very characteristic appearance. They're called the owl's eyes. It does look like an owl a little bit. And it's very common in the U.S. 50% of the U.S. is infected. That's what our epidemiology numbers tell us. In some countries, 100%. But very much like Epstein-Barr, most infections are asymptomatic, and your biggest issue will typically be in fetuses, newborns, and immunodeficient or immunosuppressed patients. And our last DNA virus is called Hepatitis. That's the family name. Hepa is of the liver. DNA, it's a DNA virus. So Hepatitis invades and replicates in liver cells. And hepatitis B is a hepatinovirus. And so that's the one we're going to focus on a little bit. It actually has, the way the particles, the viral particles appear, it actually has a couple different appearances. You have some spherical particles, and you have some, I guess you could say, elongated particles. They're called filamentous. And then you have the spherical particle technically is small. Then there's something called the Dane particle, but there's different shapes, is my point here. So under the microscope, you see the viral particles look actually different because there's different shapes of the viral particles. It's interesting. And the liver is really important for your anatomy and physiology, for your physiology. And so it's going to affect, it has serious effects on you if you get hepatitis. But there is a vaccine, and that's really reduced the Hep B in the U.S. anyway. I think it's been effective in the world in general. So hepatitis is inflammation of the liver. Hepatitis B is the only DNA virus that causes hepatitis. There are RNA viruses that cause hepatitis as well. So Hep A and Hep C are RNA viruses, but Hep B is a DNA virus. But they all cause virtually the same symptoms. Jaundice, which is where your tissues look yellow, your skin, your eyes look yellow because there's no breakdown of bilirubin in your blood, and it looks yellow, and it's really indicating that there's poison in your body that's not being removed by your liver. But that's the phenotype. That's what it looks like. You have a lot of problems physiologically from that. And then the last thing we looked at in this lecture is just a general epidemiological graph. A lot of different diseases look kind of like this. The year at the bottom might be different, but you have a disease. It's at a reasonably high incidence. Then they come up with a vaccine. When they introduce the vaccine, typically there's a little bit of a lag time before you start seeing the incidence of the disease to drop. And typically what's reasonable is, a reasonable interpretation is, the vaccine is effective and reducing the incidence of the disease in the population. It's a reasonable interpretation. And that's typically how we interpret this kind of data. You know, when the MMR vaccine was introduced, and we'll look at MMR in chapter 25, the incidence of MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella went down dramatically. So it means, very likely means the vaccine worked and it was effective at reducing the incidence. So maybe the most reasonable interpretation of this data is that vaccines work. Because we see this kind of pattern over and over again, no matter what vaccine in particular the data is focusing on. So that is my coverage of Chapter 24.